Hi YouTube. I've been using Logstash for a good number of years now, and over that time I've had a couple of opportunities to think how I would like to add some extra value to my logging. And I wanted to take you through this process and show you an easier way of getting started, help clear up some of those occasional developer sort of issues that come across. We'll smooth out that pathway, show you how to make a Ruby plugin as well as a pure Java plugin, and the basic process for going through that, including generating plugins, doing the unit testing and coding, the various tips and techniques along the way, as well as performance testing. So I'll take you through a couple of scenarios first, just to help set the scene. Before I should do that, I should say what assumptions I'm making of your skills. So I'm assuming that you know how to use Docker and that you can run that on your development environment. I'm going to assume that you know how to use Logstash. Not particularly complex, it's just so long as you know the basic understandings of inputs, filters, outputs, how to string those together, you'll be fine. I'm not going to assume that you're a Ruby or a Java developer. I would not call myself a Java or Ruby developer, and I wasn't before I went down this road of making a Logstash plugin. I am a programmer myself. Generally, C and Python are my sort of languages of choice, but I'll quite happily, dip my toe in any language. And the good thing about this is that you don't actually need to learn a lot about Ruby or Java in order to add value meaningfully as a Logstash plugin developer. I'm going to assume that you know how to use Git. Not a whole lot, but you want to use it for particularly if you're going to be working with things like GitHub. So first use case that I wanted. I have lots of logs from network devices, as well as things like web server logs and so forth, and you probably do too. When you've got networking logs particularly, you often want to filter these in such a way that it breaks it down to different parts of the network. So you might have a whole lot of log messages, and you want to say, well, I don't care about, for example, the distribution layer. I don't care about maybe wireless access points. Maybe I care about a particular VLAN. Or you want, for example, maybe in your IP address information database. It might be in some sort of application or a spreadsheet, doesn't really matter. But you might have some sort of mapping. This particular subnet is for maybe this particular campus or this particular building or this particular use case or this particular type of device. So it's nice to be able to take that information that's locked up in your IP address information system, IP address management, IPAM system, and make some extra use of that. Biggest example would be saying, I have an IP of like a log from a switch, but what subnet does that belong to? I can't get that subnet information from the logs, and if I've got lots of subnets, and who doesn't in a large network, then it's not really feasible to have a big long Logstash configuration that sort of manually maps that. You want to be able to have something that quickly looks that up in a useful sort of database, ideally without going off machine, and gives you the relevant information. What you need depends on you, and it's completely up to you. It's also good for figuring out where doing like aggregations or like top 10 type of things. So given a particular log message, maybe you found an issue, you could say, am I seeing this in different some parts of the network more than others? It's very useful for a number of things. So how are we going to solve this? What's our architecture? So you might think this is very similar to the notion of a GeoIP lookup, and it is, except we're not actually necessarily caring about geographical information, although maybe you would. But in general, we want to say, I have an IP, stick that into some sort of lookup process, and I want the output to be, well, whatever I put in when I create the database. So it might be, for example, here's an IP, and the output is the VLAN, the subnet ID, maybe a building code or a campus, type of traffic. Maybe it's a server VLAN or a user VLAN or a guest Wi-Fi, whatever it means for your network. Sounds pretty useful, and indeed it is. But how do we go about doing that? We need a way of creating that MaxMind DataBase, that MMDB file that the likes of GeoIP, MaxMind's GeoIP tools use to look up. Now MaxMind have been really good. They've got a blog post about how to create your own MaxMind database. The problem is that it's not approachable for a lot of developers, but that's only because the only library that MaxMind support for writing a MaxMind database is in Perl, which is not really many people's favorite language. So what I've done is I've created a bit of tooling that you describe what you want in a MaxMind database in terms of a JSON document, and then you pass it to my tool and it creates a MaxMind database. It's actually pretty simple, but the tooling helps to simplify it. However, that only takes us to the point where we've got a custom MaxMind database. So we need something that will take that information, consume that, and use that to enrich the logs, the events that are passing through Logstash. This is very much like the Logstash filter GeoIP. However, the Logstash filter GeoIP plugin, that requires a particular schema. So it makes assumptions that you're dealing either with the City Light, the GeoCity, or the ASN database from MaxMind. We don't have that. We have something much more generic that we've specified ourselves. So we're going to need some plugin that is similar to that will work with a much more open schema and just take whatever fields that we specify. Another use case is logs going through a proxy. So for example, you might have in your data center, your internet access policy for your servers are that you want traffic to go out via a proxy like Squid, such that you have a mechanism for whitelisting where your servers can go out to, and for logging the traffic that they send, which could be useful to see if a server has been broken into and people are trying to break out to other places. In this kind of environment, you might want to say, well, what is the top N destination sites going through my my proxy. Maybe you want to graph that over time. It seems to get, ooh, there's a lot more traffic going to that site at the moment. Maybe that correlates with some other interesting behavior. So we need to try and summarize this in a useful way, because we don't have site as such in the access logs that go through Squid. We've got a fully qualified domain name in the case of a connect method, and we need some way of sort of aggregating that into a useful notion of what site is that fully qualified domain name a part of. So in order to do this properly, because there's a lot of things that are around this, in order to do this properly, we should use the public suffix list. And well, I'll explain what that means in a later video when we actually get around to that. So we have two use cases. One of these I'm going to implement in Java, and one of these I'm going to implement in Ruby. So the goals for this particular series, of which there are 4 videos, maybe more if I feel so inclined. The first step is that we want to streamline the development process as much as we reasonably can. When you're not doing Logstash development really frequently, it can be a real pain to actually get all your tool sets installed and configured, making sure that they're not conflicting with other similar tools on your system. And a lot of the problems that you strike end up being environmental in nature. So we want to eliminate as many possibilities of going wrong as we can. In the third video, we're going to take a simple plugin. We're going to create a simple plugin using the Logstash plugin generate command, and we're going to use that to create our public suffix DNS summarization plugin. We're going to look at things like how we actually generate the plugin, the things that we need to do in order to get that working nicely. We're going to look at some tips and tricks like how to do things like logging, how to do the unit testing, as well as how to integrate that into our development flow with Visual Studio Code and Div Containers that have been created from our previous video on easy development environment. Once we've done that, we're going to change tack. We're going to look at how we do a plugin in Java. So that's going to be quite a different sort of tooling experience. We're going to see that there are a few issues to be aware of, particularly around things like documentation and provided code. The Java plugins are very new, but I think you'll find if you already know Java, you might well prefer a Java plugin and someone that you can ask some questions of, and hopefully that'll answer some of your issues there. So both the Ruby plugin and the Java plugin are not meant to be toy problems. They both include some realistic sort of dependencies. They both include some realistic unit testing as well as performance testing, which is fun to think about. So that's the goals for this series. Now, you might be wondering, am I capable of doing this? So in order to help answer that question, maybe you should know a bit about my background. That way you can evaluate yourself. So I'm neither a Ruby nor a Java programmer, as I've mentioned, but I've done plenty of work in the past supporting JVMs. So I'm a systems engineer generally, but I am trained in computer science. I'm quite comfortable in languages like C and Python, and I'd quite happily play with any other languages as well. Like I said, we don't need much Ruby or Java skills. It's pretty simple. You don't even need to know things like how to create, say, a class. If you're comfortable in writing functions in any language, then you should be fine. I've been a Logstash user since about, what was Logstash 1.5, which was about 2012. The good thing about Logstash, from my perspective, is that it doesn't really change much, which is a refreshing distinction from a lot of the other sort of elastic stack that gets challenging to keep up with. So I'm not a Windows developer at all. I'd be much more comfortable considering myself a Linux sort of Linux focused developer, if a developer is the right word. Maybe I should say a Linux toolsmith. But I work in a Windows environment, and my development environment in this case is a work provided laptop running Windows with things like, GPOs, group policies. So there are some potential restrictions that if you're in a similar environment such as myself, you might have to be aware of some of these potential limitations, but we'll walk you through that process. It's ends up being fairly good, so long as you can do things like run Docker, ideally get to the internet directly without having to go through a proxy. You'll be fine. You will need some administrative access on your machine in order to do things like use Docker. So, before we go any further, let's have a brief recap of Logstash plugins. So this is going to be very high level, and then we'll look at some an overview of some of the things that you might want to read about on the Logstash website. In fact, let's do that now. So here I have the part of the documentation for Logstash, and if you're struggling to find this, just go to Learn, and that's Docs. That'll take you to this page. Scroll down until you get to Logstash. Now we're covering only version 7.9 in this video series. However, as I said, Logstash doesn't change that much. Just be aware that if you're wanting to do the Java route, that support came in at about 7.2, I think, when it was G8, possibly 7.1. But if you're looking at just reasonably latest Logstash, then the Java-based stuff will be fine. The Ruby stuff shouldn't have really changed much at all, really. In terms of plugin support, it's very consistent. So you're going to want the Logstash reference, which gives you this document. And if you're clicking around in the documentation, you'll see this gets replicated on the right hand side. When you're dealing with plugins, then there are about 3 sections of this documentation you should make sure you focus on and read entirely. One is working with plugins. So this shows you how to do things like generate a plugin. We'll see that in a later video. And the event API. This is what I wanted to show you here. The event API is basically says how you do things like get and set the various fields within an event. So it's quite descriptive. It's not in a particularly sort of structured form. And if you're approaching this from a Java point of view, just note that it is basically the same. And if you're looking for a Java documentation, this is still relevant. There is no real Java documentation. Well, there is. It's just not very useful. There doesn't appear to be a lot of Java doc comments within the source code. But it is kind of useful, and I'll show you how to extract that in a later video. So you can see how you do things like setting particular things, metadata. This documentation is more comfortable with Ruby plugins, but if you find some sample source code, then you can easily map that into Java as well, and I'll show you that in a later video. Once you've read that, you'll want to have a look at this section here, which is relevant for you if you're going to be doing a Ruby plugin. And even if you're doing Java plugins, you'll still want to read this part here, where we're talking about submitting and documentation and so forth. If you do want to do a Java plugin, then you want to read this section here. Yeah, pretty simple. I'm not going to go through that in this video. So let's just recap the bits that we need to know about for Logstash plugins. So recall that we have input plugins, we have filter plugins, we have output plugins, we've also got codec plugins. So you'll probably be familiar with like the JSON lines codec or the Ruby debug codec. And you'll probably be familiar with inputs like file or syslog. You'll be familiar with outputs like Elasticsearch, maybe file, and filters like grok, GOIP, date, those kind of things. You may also be familiar with the concept of an integration plugin. Now, I wasn't familiar with the concept of an integration plugin because those are kind of new, but don't worry, all those is a type of plugin that provides maybe input, filter and output capabilities within the same plugin. It doesn't really make any difference to the code or to the Logstash configuration that you would write. It's just about making sure that particular gems, plugins, can encapsulate more of the code. In order to generate the plugin, we're going to use the Logstash plugin generate command. This is the same program, Logstash plugin, that you would use to install a plugin. In earlier versions of Logstash, significantly earlier I think, you would have had to just clone an existing Git repo, make a bunch of changes, and then call that your new plugin. Plugins these days can either be defined in either Ruby or as a pure Java API. Now recall that Logstash is a program that is defined in JRuby, and that means that it's written essentially in Ruby, but it runs on the JVM. In practice, what that actually means is that there's a bunch of Ruby running on a JVM, but with various code that's been optimized and also running in Java. So you get this interplay of code that is defined in Ruby. You've got that calling into Java kind of code, and that's all running on the JVM. Now, Generally, if you're creating a Ruby plugin, you don't need to write any Java. But if you're looking at the existing source code for things like Logstash filter GOIP, for example, you'll notice that that's some Ruby code. That's effectively a Ruby plugin that's doing some backdoor sort of private API stuff to do some Java stuff, and that's all running on the JVM. So that's sort of like a hack, but it's there for optimization. I only say that because if you're looking to do a pure Java API, try not to look for example source code using existing modules. There are some that you can use as a useful pure Java reference, but I'll point you to those in a moment. Now, when we're dealing with plugins and thinking of, is this a Ruby plugin or is it a pure Java plugin, we're also considering the tooling that we have to use. So in Ruby, we've got we need to have some unit testing, and that in Logstash is done using the RSpec tool. So we're using test-driven development with RSpec to write our unit tests. And if you haven't done this before, don't worry. It's actually really satisfying once you've done this a few times. This was my first time doing meaningful test-driven development, and I found it wonderfully liberating and strangely addictive with all the little green dots. In Java, if you're going to be doing making a pure Java plugin, you're not going to be using RSpec. You're going to be using Gradle, actually the Gradle wrapper, so Gradle W, and you're going to be doing your unit testing with JUnit. Specifically it's JUnit 4, but that's a detail for another video. Regardless of whether we're dealing with a Ruby plugin or a Java plugin, they're all going to be combined, they're all going to be packaged as a gem. Now gems are a Ruby sort of construct, and typically those gems are hosted on the Ruby Gems website. This is a bit like, say, a pip package or an npm package, if you're not used to that. In terms of what that actually looks like, if you go to the Ruby Gems website, the architecture of that particular gem will show up as being Java. That just means it's for JRuby. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's a pure Java API or necessarily a Ruby API. It just means that this particular gem is only usable within JRuby. Finally, just to sum up, let's have a consideration of some of the pain points that we experience as beginner Logstash developers. So this is talking about Logstash plugin developers, not necessarily someone who's like a core maintainer. They're commonly working with Logstash, but people like you and me, we have day jobs that don't necessarily relate to Logstash. So the first most painful sort of thing, actually you could consider those top two there to be very much the same, actually the top three. It's all talking about environmental cleanliness. So Logstash is defined in JRuby, which is basically a distribution of Ruby. In order to run all this, you need a Java installed. That needs to be a particular kind of Java with versioning. You've got versioning for JRuby, maybe you've got multiple versions of that. Particularly if you're on a Mac, you might already have Ruby installed somewhere else. Maybe it comes with your system. There's lots of ways in which you can get things rather confused. So one of the things, and this is similar to like if you're dealing with Python as well, you need to make sure that the things that you're installing get installed in a nice encapsulated environment over here, and don't try and mess with your system installation. You don't want to end up, picking up different tools when you think you're using this one over here, but you're actually using this one there. And this is very easy to do, and is not very well documented, which is probably why there's so many questions on the Logstash forums and GitHub issues that can be traced back to environmental difficulties. So that's effectively those top three. In those next two, we basically have the two ecosystems to learn. So not just two languages. We don't need to worry so much about having to learn some Ruby or having to learn some Java, although of course we have to learn some Ruby and would have to learn some Java. Thankfully we don't have to become experts in it. But we've also got those runtimes to deal with. So for example, we've got Ruby and its development tools like Gem, Bundler, RSpec. I've probably missed something out. Knowing how to do things like debug that code. And we've got the Java environment as well. So even if we're a Java developer, or we're comfortable in a Java environment, maybe we'd still have to learn how to use things like Gradle, JUnit, and so forth. The other problem that we find, which is frankly more of an annoyance, it doesn't really get so much in the way, although your feelings may differ, is when we go to actually install a plugin and starting Logstash, it can be very slow. Installing the plugin is much slower than actually starting a Logstash. Now, if you've used Logstash for a while, you'll know that Logstash itself takes quite a while to actually start up. But installing a plugin, for some reason, takes a lot longer. And I'm looking forward to the day when they can nail that one on the head. But that aside, you don't need to install plugins quite so much. And if you are, maybe you should be thinking, well, is there some unit testing that maybe I should be doing some more of? So that's it for this episode. In the next episode, we're going to look at a notion of Div Containers, and this is how we're going to tidy up a lot of these environmental concerns and make the tooling much more accessible in a very fast way. The idea being use effectively a Docker container or Docker image that has all the tools we need already installed and configured with the right kind of environment, such that we can then just import our code and run the commands to build it, test it, make a gem. It'll be sweet. See you in the next episode.